What is the U19 Club? It's the unofficial moniker of Western manga fans for series that end under 19 chapters. Becoming a member of the U19 Club is a sign of shame for the work in question, as it means they manage to only fill out around 1 to 3 volumes of material before being cancelled. In this series, I dissect works of this type and see what worked, what didn't, and at what point the creator was told they were in danger, their attempts to fix it, and the eventual end. In this episode, the one that started the namesake, U19. U19 takes place in a near future where Japan is under the tyrannical control of the grown-up party, a conservative political group that has removed innumerable rights from those under 19.
He said it!
While giving substantial privileges to adults, allowing for rampant abuse of power, from forcibly shaving the hair of a girl breaking the rules, to eugenics based on blood type ranking. The rebel group Garage Kid, made up of adolescents, fight back with the power system of the series, libido. Eiji Kudo, the protagonist of the series, a high schooler who is ranked the lowest of the low within this new society, since he actively resists the adults by questioning the system and its unfairness, even though it means his family suffers from the social credit system in place. He also sews as a hobby, which is looked down upon by the government, as not an appropriate skill for a man to have. He has a crush on his childhood friend, Akari Tsukino, and would do anything to protect her. He gains the libido power of Red Line of Fate, a needle and thread that comes out of his pinky finger that he can manipulate. Akari Tsukino, childhood friend of Eiji, who reciprocates his romantic feelings, but this being a shonen manga, we don't get to explore it fully. Her blood gets ranked SSS, which forces her to switch to an all-elite school where she must await Eiji and Garage Kid to save her. She never develops libido, though she probably would have eventually, if this series had continued. Nanami. Nanami is like a discount Tenja Ida from My Hero Academia, the class president who's sex up to the adults, but is secretly in charge of the local Garage Kid chapter. Sawega. He's another one of the high-ranked blood students moved to the new school like Akari, and as per government policy, he's been paired up with a suitable mate, this being Akari. He's delighted by the prospect, so much so that he'll even fight Eiji for her. The adults. Very few adults are shown in a good light in this series, with the exception of Eiji's parents. For example, the sadistic Mr. Tani, the homeroom teacher, or the Prime Minister of Japan, Yamato Shiki, the true big bad of the series, who is shown to be absolutely ruthless and delights in the pettiness he can instill in the younger generation. The power system introduced in this series is called libido, which isn't too different from its peers in the same publication. According to the story itself, anyone should be able to access this power by being subjected to extreme strength. But specifically, teens are more likely to unlock this power. In practice, the powers that they unlock vary wildly, without much of a resource cost besides a general stamina. Powers range from magic singing to teleportation. It is most similar to a system such as My Hero Academia's Quirks, or even X-Men's Mutants. The first volume worth of chapters tend to be the artist's original undiluted vision, which always makes them interesting to read compared to later on when they need to wrap things up quickly. Yuji Kimura seems to have gotten quite the free rein to take his time with the pacing in the first few chapters. The first chapter only discusses the concept of people having powers and fighting, rather than actually showcasing it to the reader. The main premise of Garage Kid, while mentioned, isn't revealed to be an active part of the story until the end of chapter 3. He does well with making us understand the protagonist Eiji and his personality and his role in life before the call to action in the next chapter. The creator takes his time with chapter 4 to info dump the reader with how the power system works, the history of how the world came to be as it is, and the plans of Garage Kid, which is to start a revolution. Chapter 5 returns to the plot at hand to get rid of the abusive homeroom teacher, Mr. Tani, which won't be resolved until Chapter 7. This means 3 chapters were spent on what is essentially a first boss. If the series had continued for a longer period of time, then it wouldn't have been an issue. But this was 3 weeks for potential readers to drop the series as nothing substantial happened. While it's admirable to want to do a slow burn in today's day and age, with the amount of competition within the same magazine from his fellow mangakas, it isn't feasible to do so since your story will most likely be passed over for another one. Compare this to Black Clover, where in the first 3 chapters, he presents the world, the protagonist, his goals and flaws, and gets him on his way to get the plot started. As by chapter 3, Asta is already a magic knight and ready to go on adventures. Premises set, now it's time for the actual stories. Volume 1 ends with chapter 7, where Garage Kid managed to keep their libido in check and falsely accused their homeroom teacher of sexually abusing one of his students, which admittedly is the most novel idea of beating a shonen battle manga villain. The last page leads into the next story segment featuring Akari being forced to go to a new elite school. After a few more chapters, the publisher Shueisha would be getting sales reports on the first volume, which is a major part in a series' profitability, as there are many readers in Japan who don't buy the weekly publication, but rather wait for the volume release. If the reader survey wasn't kind to U19, then high volume sales would give it a new lease on life, as it would demonstrate there was a substantial audience for it. That unfortunately wasn't the case for Yuji Kimura, so starting with volume 2, the slow pace of the first volume gets replaced with a high-speed sprint as we go from secret school shenanigans to a downright siege of the elite school holding Akari. Considering the way he had been writing the story thus far, I would have presumed the initial plan would have been to keep the story slower, setting up a plan on how to save Akari, but have her remain there, keeping a long-term personal goal in play, along with the greater scope of tearing down the government. I'm not sure whether he was told that he was cancelled already, or if he was given a warning about his status, but he speeds it up and begins to introduce more characters, both to get the story moving, but also to get the attention of new readers with these new characters. It's a common manga trope, but rather than having one character at a time be introduced, we get a whole group of them where we get to be intrigued by their designs and mystery before we find out more about who they are and what they do. Think like the Phantom Troop from Hunter x Hunter, or the reveal of Baroque works from One Piece. In this case, we get the grown-up party members, each one probably planned to have been an arc in of themselves, where Garage Kid needs to defeat them. But this, of course, never came to fruition. The rest of the story, besides the last 2 chapters, revolve around the failed rescue of Akari, introducing more Garage Kid members and their powers, along with the increased scope of the government as they reveal genetically mutated soldiers to fight back. They manage to defeat these enemies and escape thanks to a newly introduced character's teleportation libido. After that long action set piece, we get a time skip for the last 2 chapters, where Kudo finally succeeds in saving Akari, though in doing so faces off against what was probably planned to be a recurring rival, Sawaga, due to Akari being their object of affection, and their powers being related.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Sawaga would have had a clear advantage with his sister's libido over Kudo's needle and thread power. Kudo defeats him and escapes with Akari to a remote island, where Garage Kid's base is now located. This leads to an actual interesting plot development, where the grown-up party now have Sawaga to both fight for them and to experiment on in order to study libido and recreate it. All of this is of course for naught, as the series ends in a way that many of these U19 Club stories do, with "our battle is just beginning." It's honestly a smart choice, as it leaves it up to the fans' imagination about how it could properly end, as well as prevents the creator from having to truly reach the finish line in an unsatisfying way. So in U19's case, the idea would be that the team would go on several missions with many twists and turns, power awakenings, training arcs, and heel face turns, before finally defeating the government and bringing justice back to Japan. I'd like to point out that Volume 2 and 3 of this manga each include a one-shot by the same creator, most likely added to give them some girth, as otherwise Volume 3 would be comparatively thinner and would not justify the price tag. I proposed that the biggest flaw of the series was the slow pace. He spends the first volume giving text dumps of world building, rather than keeping the audience engaged with more relatable personal moments. He repeats points which on their own had merit, but filled up valuable space page, resulting in the first chapter not even concluding a major event or victory. This leaves the reader with only a sense of despair, rather than a promise of what the world and the main character have to offer going forward. As much as I'd like to say that the general premise is too absurd to suspend one's disbelief for, I find that it isn't as far-fetched at its core as it appears at first glance. Generally, the older generation looks down on the younger, and on the political level, maintain policy that can be considered detrimental to said younger generation. U19's grown-up party simply raises the satire level by removing the facade behind such policy, by downright saying that kids suck and they have to behave in a certain way to be allowed to be a proper, acceptable adult. The problem is simply that, because it is just so ridiculous on the surface, moments of empathy for the children can become comical rather than serious, hurting the themes the author is conveying through the story. On another note, I am not well versed in the politics of 2017 Japan, so it may very well be that many of the points brought up in this manga are much more biting to the intended audience than it would be for me. The powers don't have a thematic bond to the world. There are plenty of stories where power sets are more or less random, such as X-Men mutants ranging from growing hair all over their bodies to controlling the goddamn weather. But U19's world didn't set itself up to need these powers until the siege of the school. The government wasn't portrayed to be using anything beyond what a modern-day police state would use. Even then, while it does show up in Chapter 2 and makes a big impact, the powers are very rarely used in the beginning and isn't even the main solution to their first obstacle, although it helped, making the addition of power seem forced and unnecessary. And if one wants to get into stereotypes, the average boy reading Shonen Jump probably wouldn't find the main character sewing and getting sewing powers to be as cool as other competing protagonists in the same magazine. I honestly liked the secret rebel group angle of Garage Kid. Had the series kept that angle instead of blowing it literally up during the second volume, there could have been a nice tension of how they tried to overthrow the adults through subterfuge and manipulation. And for how unnecessary the power system was, along with its ridiculous name, the main character's sewing needle power was more interesting than the usual katanas, punches, and dragon powers that many protagonists are equipped with, allowing for good versatility in how he solved problems. A neat subversion of the usual romance in shonen came with both Kudo and Araki actually liking each other, and while the cancellation rushed it, there was already more of a relationship between them compared to the usual will they, won't they, and harems that many other mangas rely on. As exaggeratedly evil as he was, Mr. Tani was a delight to see in action, as he was easy to hate and enjoy his awful antics. It's so extreme that rather than be horrified by his behavior, I laugh at the lengths he goes to get a rise out of AG, which culminates in him tossing Akari's desk out the window. It's so ludicrous that any tension is lost in favor of comedy, despite the tone otherwise suggesting the former. A nice thematic moment that worked well was when the leader of the grown-up party comes to capture Garage Kid at the school, and shows off how his experience defeats their naivety, with him beating two of the members despite not using any special powers or technology. If the manga had continued, then that would have probably been a through line in any confrontation between the kids and the adults to showcase the pros and cons of their generations. And while anti-authority individualist stories aren't unique in manga, to have one that directly calls out the creator's own government, even if it's a fictional version of it, is an appreciated sentiment when one considers how many well-received mangas are about working with the governing body, twists and traitors notwithstanding. The whole story is almost like an exaggerated YA dystopian novel, with the plucky teens fighting against a tyrannical government who just hates kids. The reasoning for it can be seen as flimsy, but as I mentioned before, while perhaps naive, it's simply a full-on execution to the core of an older generation's wishes towards the younger, becoming a full-blown political satire. Perhaps if one removed the superpower angle, which by itself doesn't naturally fit into the premise of the story and comes across as existing for the sake of interesting battles, and made it into a comedy instead, one would have a fun satire of the relationship between the older and newer generation. That way, the overly exaggerated policies of the government would not feel so off, and the kids could find more interesting ways to defeat the adults besides fighting them, such as they did with the homeroom teacher by framing him for sexual abuse. Each chapter could revolve around some new rule that's put into place that's an exaggerated version of something kids at the time could relate to. They'd portray the awful punishments the guilty would suffer, and the protagonist would need to find means of defeating the rules through subterfuge. For example, they make a point in the very first page about the maximum length of hair. They could do something where they replace all the rulers that the teachers use to measure it, with new ones that are just slightly off that allows them to have longer hair than allowed. Then that whole plan would require some Ocean's 11 type shenanigans, and they'd make the teachers look like fools. Yuji Kimura probably wanted to take it slower if given the choice, with Kudo's infiltration of the high school being more low-key than how it ended up, keeping up the secrecy for as long as possible before a more major event results in the reveal of libido to the government. Presumably he'd have set up a roadmap of goals as well, with each party member being a target necessary to defeat, each becoming a story arc as they fight them. The plot developments that were revealed in the end would most definitely allow the government to match Garage Kid with their own libido, resulting in some exciting battles between them, as well as probably having Segawa join the good guys eventually. Even with the most patient of the editors and readers, it probably wouldn't have lasted longer than 5 volumes before needing to be wrapped up anyways. I have read far worse manga, both amateur and professional, but being among the greats of Shonen Jump puts a heavier expectation upon the work. The creative choice of slow burn within a competitive publication is, in my opinion, the nail in the coffin, more than the premise or the characters. By volume 1, Luffy had already defeated 2 villains and gained his first crewmate, and even teased the next big villain and crew member. Bleach had Ichigo gain his powers, learn his responsibilities, and defeat a few hollows and set up the next arc. Naruto sets up the world, character motivations, and the main supporting cast while ending out on an actual cliffhanger regarding whether they will pass a test. The point is, within those first 7 to 8 chapters that make up the first volume, the author has to get the story running, give the first real success to show the audience that the protagonist is capable, and to promise further, long-running adventures after the first volume. The previous Big 3 examples accomplished most of that in their first chapters, while U19 struggled to manage it by the end of chapter 7. As of recording this, Yuji Kimura has, to my knowledge, not returned with a new series or one-shot since the cancellation of U19. If you liked this episode, subscribe for more looks into less popular, forgotten works in Shonen Jump.